you to Sebastian, Severin, Ruth and Ed for that. Now, when it comes to cashless societies, the question is when rather than if it's going to happen. But there's also a question to be answered about what cashless is actually going to mean. Will it mean no cash at all, or will it simply mean less cash? Well, our next session will discuss the wider implications of either scenario. Please welcome to the stage, in conversation with the Independent's Hamish McRae, we have the CEO of UAE Exchange, try saying that 5 times fast, Promoth Manghat, and we have the VP of Solutions at Verifone, Nathan Gill. Please give them a warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much, and we're really lucky here to have people both from the world of cash and the world of non-cash, because Promoth, you've probably, anybody here ever used Travelex in their lives? Hands up, please. Anyone use Travelex? Travelex? Few hands up. Come on, must be more than that. Promoth handles cash. He also handles great international payments, but if you go to an airport booth and you need cash and Travelex is there, Promoth's company is the second largest in the world that does this. If you go to a shop and use your card in a machine, somebody has to figure out how that money gets transferred around. And that's Verifone. Nathan here represents that. So we have two people doing different aspects of this shift from cash to online. I want, however, just now, before I ask them, just to carry out a little experiment. Does anybody in this room here not have any cash on them at all? Hands up, please. Anybody want to? Okay, so, gosh, 10% of the room. Anybody here got more than 100 euros on them? Not very many. Anybody here got more than 3,300 euros on them? Okay, I'll tell you why I asked that last question. Did you know that if you add up all the euros in circulation in the world and all the people who live in the Eurozone, there are for every man, woman and child in the Eurozone 3,300 euros. It's going up by about 8% a year. So there's this strange paradox. We're all switching to cashless, but there's more and more cash around. We'll try and explore that paradox now. And Promoth, I'm going to start with you. Yeah. Tell us what's happening.
I think it's a very interesting paradox that we see. If you see across the globe, roughly 85% of the payments globally is happening through cash. We have got roughly talking about $5 trillion of cash in circulation. And if you compare that into the currency in circulation, into GDP, and see that we were roughly around 7% in 2000, which has gone up to 9.6% by 2016. But equally important is that we're increasingly seeing the emergence of non-cash. If you look at the value of card payments in the CPMI countries, it has grown to 25% in 2016 from 13% in 2000. For instance, from Finabler perspective itself, one of the brand that we have is UAE Exchange, which handles global money transfer. We handle close to $30 billion. Only to market like India, which we handle $7 billion. We have seen trend where not so long back, 10 years back, 60% of the transfers that we do to India was all in cash, which now, of the 7 billion that we handled last year, 82% is non-cash. It has gone to bank accounts, it goes to mobile wallets, and all those kind of things. So which means that, we see definitely the real emergence of the infrastructure of the non-cash really coming up. We see financial inclusion really driving the non-cash in the emerging markets, where the non-cash transaction accounts for almost 90% of the payments in those kind of economies. For instance, a market like India specifically has tripled the digital payments in the last 3 years from 2.5% to roughly more than 7% on the mobile payments. So we see increasing amounts, so I think definitely cash is becoming less, but it is still prevalent in many of the markets, including some of the sectors in advanced economies.
Nathan, now you are getting rid of cash. That is your residual debt. You are figuring out other ways of it. Tell me about ways in which you're getting rid of cash.
Yeah, so we generate a couple $2 billion a year off of getting rid of cash. 100% of our revenue is based on non-cash payments. And I think that some of the things that we see happening, first of all, every year we ship more and more payment devices that enable card-based or mobile-based payment. So that increases every year. We're shipping these to more markets than ever before as digital payments continue to increase. And interestingly, I think what we're seeing is that new technologies like contactless, like mobile payment, are continuing to also drive that shift from cash to digital payments. Every single one of our payment gateways that we operate around the world, month after month, year over year, increasing the number of transactions. It used to be that many card-based transactions tended to have higher average transaction values, but we see that's not the case anymore. People are using contactless for everyday transactions. And I think what we also see is that banks increasingly are encouraging this shift away from cash because there's an expense for banks to operate and manage cash. They don't want to have to do that. And so if they can transform to a digital-only business model, like we've seen many of them do up in the Nordic countries, there's a big savings there. I think additionally, for merchants, cash is an expense for them to manage, but sometimes the cost of accepting card-based payment was more expensive than accepting cash. As we see new payment schemes and we see new account-to-account type debit formats come out in the market, we actually find that there's a savings for merchants as well. And so they too are looking to reduce the amount of cash that they're managing. So across the board in our business, yes, we're seeing a continued increase in that conversion away from cash.
And any particular, are you indifferent as to whether it's a mobile phone or a contactless, or do you care which technology you're getting rid of with cash?
Absolutely not. In fact, our job is to enable as many different ways for consumers to pay and merchants to accept payments as possible. And I think what we're seeing is that the number of payment methods is increasing. Take, for example, what's happened in the Nordics. The banks have collaborated and created a new mobile payment method called mobile pay. And in Denmark alone, when that first launched, literally overnight, it went to be the third most downloaded application in the App Store after Facebook and Facebook Messenger. It now accounts for over 50% of payments. And for us, we didn't have a choice. When we get a call from the banks in the Nordics and say, Verifone, we want you to accept our new form of payment, we have to say absolutely, of course. Our challenge has been, we get a lot of these calls, and how do we move quickly enough so that we can satisfy the demands of new forms of payment? And what we've had to do is open up our platform so that lots of companies that are probably represented here can enable new forms of payment, can enable new experiences that ultimately take a consumer that's pretty accustomed to a fantastic online experience and start to replicate that digital experience in store.
Yes. Now, there are upsides, very clear upsides to the shift away from cash. And I'd like you both just to, you've spoken a little about it. Promoth, I'd like a few more thoughts from you about the upsides, but I want us all to think about the downsides as well. So some upsides.
I think definitely what we see from a cost and transparency perspective, it really improves that. That's the first thing. But what we see specifically from being a large player on money transfer, what we definitely see is that you can bring, conventionally, if you look at banks are largely meant to deal with middle income to the higher income segment of society. Banks are not structured to handle the low income segments. Even if the low income segment comes and deal with the banks, banks, they have to pay a price which could be afforded by the middle income and higher income. And what we see with the kind of cashless, specifically where you are able to do with mobile coming in, where you could offer the services exactly what you could do on a brick and mortar onto mobile. And we're increasingly seeing that be increasing, and we've been a great beneficiary of that in markets like Africa, markets like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and parts of other Asia. We are increasingly seeing people coming largely into the financial fold, which is a very important thing. And number two is that from a government perspective, for example, we saw that in India, were laying the infrastructure for the non-cash, but same time regulating and making it difficult to do large transactions using cash, which definitely increases the trail and the auditability of the transactions, which should definitely help the economy to knock down the parallel economy, as well as to making sure that increases the collection of the tax revenues and making it much more socio-economical for consumer, for economy at large as well. We see that specifically happening to do that. And two is the way we see at this point of time, where increasingly consumers, with the emergence of the millennials, were coming in, where they look at more of using the experiences and do that, and cashless becomes an important element of that as well. So we definitely see that it brings down the cost, it brings many people largely into the fold, is the large two headlines that we see.
So socially, if you're disadvantaged, the move from cash plays to you. It isn't a disadvantage. It isn't, the rich can do what they like. People who do not have a lot of money actually benefit from the move away from cash.
Exactly. I think that the challenge...
That's really important.
The challenge at this point of time, if you see, it is not the access. For example, now, say one of the markets that we're quite active is Africa. 90% of the adults in Africa have mobile phones, but only 1/3 of them have only bank accounts.
Yeah.
So the trouble is not the access. How do you use that and get them the instruments and products to make them cashless?
Yes.
And we increasingly see that, and that is the advantage largely a cashless brings in.
I don't know how many banks we have in the room, but clearly this is very important. Do you want to follow that through at all?
Yeah, I think just in terms of benefits, there's clearly different benefits in developing countries versus developed countries. I think, what we're seeing in that consumers and merchants alike are time-starved. I don't know how many of us have been in a coffee shop, for example, and we're trying to grab a quick coffee on our way to a meeting, and somebody in front of us takes out a whole thing of change and starts counting coins, and there's a part of you that just wants to say, I'll pay for it, just go, I'll add it to my bill. Merchants kind of think that way too. If you talk to some of the big grocers, they manage the checkout experience in milliseconds, and they need to speed that up as much as possible. And so what we're seeing is that speed, convenience, all really important, but also taking some things that were physical and digitizing them helps to encourage and benefit consumers. And I'll give you a couple examples. One would be in Finland, for example. We, and all the Nordics, but in Finland specifically, we're offering an installment payments program through a partner we have called MASH. And somebody can walk up to our payment device. They don't need a card. They don't need cash. They just enter in their national ID. Once they enter that in, they'll receive an invoice 14 days later, and they can choose to pay that immediately or pay that over time. Other partners like Klarna and Svea and others have that business model. That's a nice, flexible way of paying that consumers didn't have in the past. Another example would be in restaurants, casual dining restaurants. Their biggest challenge is frequency. On average, people only go to a casual dining restaurant 5 to 6 times per year. If they can increase that 10%, 20%, it's a huge advantage. And so we've got a partner called Payment Loyalty that creates a fun little game at checkout where you can play to win. And the idea is you always win something. It remembers your card, and as long as you come back within 30 days and you use that same card or you bring your receipt, you get a free dessert or a free glass of champagne or something like that. So it's driving repeat visits. And then the final sort of concrete example, I would say, is that plastic loyalty cards, stamp cards, are going away. They're becoming digitized, which again is a benefit to consumers and merchants because you're not carrying all these cards around and merchants aren't having to process them. So these are added, value-added services that make paying with cards or your mobile device,
Yeah.
a frictionless benefit for consumers and merchants.
There are, however, perceived disadvantages, and I absolutely buy the advantages. Can we talk a bit about
I
those?
think one aspect is culture.
Yeah.
I think culture is a very important aspect in handling cash versus non-cash. And increasingly, another aspect, increasingly with the advent of technology and with the kind of data that being used, how people perceive privacy is in another aspect of looking at that. How can we manage that is another dichotomy that we need to really handle of to do that. And thirdly is that, one should not push the non-cash agenda unless the environment and ecosystem is really prepared enough. That is an equally important aspect. Otherwise you will end up in a situation where, for something which is very dear to me is including people onto the larger financial stream. So you don't want a situation where you don't have enough infrastructure available and then you push the non-cash agenda and then you find many people being marginalized into the mainstream of things. I think these are the three aspects. I think one should be looking at that from a downside perspective.
Nathan, any perceived disadvantages?
Well,
Privacy?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are those who operate in a way that they don't want to be tracked. They don't want to have their data stored. They want to remain anonymous. And, certainly folks have concerns about privacy, and then there's the gray and the black market. And I think for some of those markets, moving them away from cash will never happen.
Yes.
And so that's certainly a disadvantage to that segment. I think then there's another segment that, is just comfortable with cash, and it's the way they've always paid for things, and, it will take a lot to maybe change that. And then, I think for others, there's always the concern that there could be a terrorist attack, there could be some sort of security issue, and they want their fail-safe option of having cash. So I think that, for those types of groups and individuals, there are some disadvantages.
And I think it's quite mainstream in some countries, Germany, just to keep a lot of cash around, and those 3,300 euros have to be somewhere, and they can't all be in drug dealers or whatever. Okay. I want to do a bit of blue sky thinking. At the moment, we have ways of paying which would have been unthinkable. Credit cards we had around for a long time, but the idea of using a phone to pay something, 10 years ago, that didn't happen. I want you just to do a bit of blue sky thinking. Where in 5 years' time might we be? Will it be iris recognition, face recognition payments? What's the next big thing in terms of non-cash payments? Promoth, I'll start with you.
I think non-cash payments will increasingly become frictionless. That's the thing, right? So, people look at cards even as a friction to make a payment.
Absolutely.
So how do you make it frictionless? So it could be NFC, it could be QR codes, the way of doing that. And interestingly, with the kind of the way the new age consumers look at of more not really concerned about ownership, but really concerned about only access. Where when they buy products and services, it's not that they will buy it, they buy the experience, which means that the payments has to really get embedded into the kind of experience that you do. So that's kind of things which we'll see if we do that. And QR code payments is really catching up in emerging economies. We see that increasingly in China. We see that in India. And parts of Africa as well in that, forget about the advanced economies, which you talk about NFCs and so on and so forth. So payments will lose its nature. It has to become embedded. What form factor it may take, at this point of time, the form factor that you see could be NFCs or QR or plastics, but gradually it will become embedded and it will lose its nature.
Okay. Nathan, blue sky from you?
Well, I think we're going to see all of those things because they all work, right? The question is through what medium. I don't think we're going to see retinal scanning at scale in physical retail environments anytime soon. I think we're going to see payment by facial recognition continue to increase. And
So,
that
so
will be
just you go to the checkout and you just look at a screen.
well, I think it's going to be more peer-to-peer. I think in the case
Okay.
of in-store physical retail, obviously NFC works really well, and that's embedded in a lot of the major wallets. In some cases, some of the major technology providers, Apple, for instance, has restricted their NFC usage for payment. And so in some of those cases, we've seen companies take advantage of Bluetooth low energy to actually communicate with devices and make a transaction occur. But honestly, I think the stuff that we're going to see scale is the stuff that works. NFC works. QR codes works really well. It's not as sexy as scanning somebody's eye or getting a blueprint of their veins, but it works. So I think the simple things that have scale are the things that we're going to see grow the fastest. But in the peer-to-peer world and other mediums, I think we'll see some pretty kind of sexy iris facial scans start to grow.
Okay. Any more blue sky from you, Promoth? Anything? I mean, I tell you what troubles me. What troubles me is there are cities in China where if you want to have access to getting an airline ticket, you have to be a good citizen. I could envisage quite a lot of pushback as a world where every single transaction you make, every place you are, is all recorded, by the authorities. It works in Estonia, but I'm not sure it would work in North London. Or maybe it'd be better if it did work in North London. We'll leave that one aside. This is a reference to the stabbings. I think that what will emerge, and correct me if I'm wrong, will be a balance that people will be able to choose which way they want to pay. And if they still want to pay in cash, they'll be allowed to do so. Is that fair?
Exactly. I think if you look at, as the intro was mentioning, if it is not cashless, it is less cash now.
Yeah.
So what we should see, it should be lesser cash going forward. But cash will exist. I don't think cash is not going to get extinct or do that. And like the kind of death that you saw of instruments like checks or other modes of payments is not the fate of cash, at least for the next 5 years.
Yes.
But we will increasingly, definitely will see non-cash for two reasons. One is that the infrastructure of handling the cashless is really emerging on number one. Number two, if you look at the global population, we have got roughly 25%, 26%, almost of 2 billion people on the millennials, which should increase to almost a 1/3 by the next 5 years' time. So definitely by the kind of nature, the kind of behavior that they brings in, they definitely want to be very seamless in that. So that is going to really increase of to do that. And thirdly, we find that those economies who has really regulated on the non-cash see an upside on a long term in terms of tax collection, knocking out the parallel economy, as well as bringing the less privileged and marginalized into the larger economical stream. So what I'm very hopeful should be is a lesser cash, but cash will remain.
Nathan, a final word. Less cash, but still some cash?
Absolutely. Payments is an and business. It's not an or business. Cash will be around, but less and less.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we're out of time. Can I just thank everyone here for listening to us. Thank you both for these insights on it. And we will all meet in 2023 and discover whether there are a rather larger proportion of people who don't have any cash on them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.